So thank you to everyone who's joined us thus far. I hope that this will be a really insightful and encouraging discussion for all of you. Today, Bonnie and I are going to be discussing her book that is launching today. Congratulations.
Thank you.
The title of it is Untrustworthy, The Knowledge Crisis Breaking Our Brains, Polluting Our Politics, and Corrupting Christian Community. So just an introduction to Bonnie and myself. Bonnie is the author of Untrustworthy and A Flexible Faith, Rethinking What It Means to Follow Jesus Today, which she wrote in 2018, another book that I've really enjoyed and reviewed in the past. As a journalist, she writes opinion pieces on foreign policy, religion, electoral politics, and more. Her column, The Lesser Kingdom, appears in print and online at Christianity Today. She is a fellow at Defense Priorities, a foreign policy think tank, and her work has been published at outlets including the New York Times, The Week, USA Today, CNN, Politico, Reason, and the Daily Beast. A graduate of Bethel Seminary, she lives in Pittsburgh with her husband and twin sons. And as for me, my Substack newsletter, Granola, strives to provide readers with interesting thoughts regarding place, books, and community. You can subscribe at granola.substack.com. And I've written columns and articles for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and a few other places over the years. My book, which came out in March 2021, is titled Uprooted, Recovering the Legacy of the Places We've Left Behind. So Bonnie and I are going to start with about 30 minutes of discussion, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So be thinking of questions that you would like to ask. Feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A. I'll check both. And hopefully we can have a really insightful hour together. So Bonnie, just to start, what inspired you to write this book?
You know, it was a combination of things. Some of it was more in my private life conversations I was having, interactions among my own friends and experiences that friends were having, disagreements with loved ones that were not necessarily about political policy, but really about sort of like what are even the basic facts of the situation that we're discussing, and that feeling of being at an impasse where it doesn't even feel like you're looking at the same reality, let alone being able to discuss what should we do about this situation. And then also in my work as a journalist, I found myself just writing about, especially in 2018, 2019, 2020, a lot of themes that I gradually began to see as connected and part of this larger problem. And so finally, I decided to write about it in a little bit more durable format. That's sort of the one big downside of writing columns, is that they have such a short lifespan. And so I wanted to write something that was a little bit more comprehensive and a little bit more above the news cycle and of more longer term interest.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I really appreciate too about your book is it combines a lot of common sense and very thoughtful, practical tips with a lot of philosophy. And so one thing that you open the book with is this conversation surrounding epistemology and the fact that you believe we are experiencing in the United States an epistemic crisis. So I wondered, for those unfamiliar with this term, what does the term epistemology refer to? And what does it mean to be living in the midst of an epistemic crisis at present?
So epistemology is a branch of philosophy, and it's concerned with the study of knowledge itself. And so it asks a lot of questions like, what is knowledge? When are we justified in thinking that we have knowledge? What's the difference between, say, like knowledge and opinion, or knowledge and conjecture or belief, these kinds of questions. And a lot of the way that epistemology is done now in academic context is very esoteric. There's like these little word problems to sort of think through. If I'm in this scenario, do I really have knowledge or not? And that's interesting, like, not to knock that, but I don't think that sort of thing feels very necessary or useful to sort of the average person, because in the day-to-day, we have to sort of live with the assumption that knowledge exists and we can obtain it and we can transmit it to one another, or else we couldn't function as people. And so I think in a lot of cases, a lot of times and places, we wouldn't have to think about epistemology. We wouldn't have to know what it means. This is why the subtitle says knowledge crisis, not epistemic crisis, because most people do not know that word. And for most of the time, I think that would be, a very defensible ignorance is not something that we always need to know. But the problem is that the way we live now, the way that we, especially if we're using the internet, especially if we're very online, but even outside of like that social media space, we have such a chaotic information environment and such an onslaught of information and truth claims coming at us all day long, all the time. This is sort of the big thing that smartphones do, is that it's always there. And so it's a very different situation, certainly from you think 70 years ago, where you might have like an hour of the evening news and your morning newspaper, and that sort of very limited and defined space is your news consumption. And maybe, you talk about it at the water cooler or at work, but it's limited in quantity. It's even different, I think, from like in the 1990s, we have the rise of the 24-hour cable news cycle. Even that is different because you can't lug your TV with you to the grocery store the way you can now with your phone, where it's just always there all the time. And so we've dramatically changed in the last 20, 30 years, the way and the volume of information intake. And I think we didn't really prepare ourselves to handle that well. And so now we have what I think is an epistemic crisis, where we really struggle to figure out what is knowable, what is true, what voices are trustworthy. It's this sense of confusion and unease and uncertainty that's sort of like the ground is a little bit soft underfoot, that I think a lot of us feel when we're engaging in media and information spaces. And in that context, I think we do need to know about epistemology and be thinking a little bit more deliberately about what are my own processes and for acquiring knowledge, and what sort of person am I as I'm engaging in those processes, and how am I using that knowledge once acquired?
In addition to just the constant barrage of information that we seem to have, as you say, by carrying our smartphones with us, by being able to monitor what's happening on Twitter via our TVs and on other forms of social media, it seems that one of the difficulties of our time is that we're constantly called upon to have an opinion about whatever is happening. There's a status box constantly beckoning for us to say exactly what we think and feel. So one thing you do in your book is you provide these very helpful definitions that consider the difference between knowledge, conjecture, and opinion. Because as you say, a lot of things can get muddied in the overflow, both of information and of our own takes on that information. So I wondered if you could kind of give those definitions and talk about the importance of differentiating between some of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to have to cheat a little bit from my own text here because I don't have all this memorized. But so the classic definition of knowledge is justified true belief. And so, knowledge is something that happens in our head. It's not like a fact. A fact is something external that's out there, whereas knowledge is it's a belief. It's something that's taken in within us, and it's justified based on some evidence, and then it's true, which is to say it accords with reality. So you cannot have knowledge of something that is untrue. You can believe it and believe wrongly, but you can't actually know it. And so justified is really often the trickiest and most debated part of that definition of justified true belief, because everything that we believe is true, or else we wouldn't believe it. But that question of justification is where a lot of our fights around what is knowledge tend to land. And so opinions are different. They are beliefs, and they differ from knowledge in that they may or may not be true, and they may or may not be justified. They don't have that same qualification of having to accord with reality and having to have some sort of like publicly demonstrable basis or evidence. And then conjecture, I think, is similar. I would say that it is something maybe that you're trying to move from the sort of opinion territory to knowledge. So the justification is sort of in doubt or in process. You're in the process of assembling that justification to try to demonstrate that what you have is more in a sense than just an opinion, that it is actually that what you've conjectured is worth being deemed knowledge.
It seems like one of the places in which this can become really thorny or controversial when it comes to news is in questions of bias. Because obviously, as you say, we are all working toward knowledge. We have opinions, we have conjectures based on the set of facts at our disposal. And oftentimes, many allegations that news is, quote, fake or deceptive stem from readers' observations of bias. Perhaps a news writer has a different opinion than them, and they can sense that in the way in which they write a piece or a column. And this can happen both with right-leaning publications and with left-leaning publications. So how do we grapple with bias in the news that we read? Does a biased reporter's account of an event like an election or a political or cultural issue make them entirely untrustworthy? Why or why not? How do we balance these things as we look at the news stories and the other forms of media that we consume?
So a lot of well, two things. First, let me start by saying that sort of allegation that bias is the problem is, as you said, an incredibly common perspective. When you poll Americans on what's wrong with the media, the overwhelming critique that they make is that journalists are lying, they're doing it on purpose, and they're doing it because of their political bias. They want to help their side win by deceiving the public. I don't think that's accurate. I think that the actual problems with journalism tend to be a lot more mundane. A lot of it is about the changing business model and just trying to figure out how can we pay salaries, like, how can we bring in money? A lot of it is very tied to that. It's things like a real push for speed, a real push for being intriguing enough, or you could say more cynically, more entertaining enough or sensationalist enough to get views. But I don't think that there's nothing to the bias charge. And I would say that a lot of that critique comes from the sort of background of the mid-century model of journalism, where the business model was to appeal to as many people as possible. And the play for that was to present yourself as neutral, as objective, as, I'm giving just the facts. Now, I think that there was a truth to that. There was a lot of journalists who really aspired to that principle, and still do really aspire to that principle of objectivity, of being as neutral as possible. In practice, however, I think, one, it was a business strategy. It was not purely disinterested in principle. But two, I don't think it was ever as complete as many people thought it was. I think the idea that there was this golden age of journalism where everyone was so objective and people weren't biased back then, I think that's largely a myth perpetuated by both public and, the industry about itself. Because the reality is that people are not objective. We all have opinions. Anyone whose whole job is to be observing and analyzing politics all day is going to have opinions. That's inevitable. And it's true that in journalism, sort of the average opinion is going to be center left. That's measurable. That's true. I do not think that the existence of that bias is a bad thing. I think that's just the human condition. And I don't think that it makes journalists inherently untrustworthy. Certainly sometimes, a bias is going to be so out of control that it makes a report unreliable. But I would say that a journalist who is striving for accuracy and honesty and to convey the facts as they find them, the fact that they have their own political perspectives, or you could say more negatively, their own bias, is not necessarily going to intervene in that. Now, that's not to say that you don't need safeguards. You need a diversity of perspectives in the newsroom so that you have editors and other journalists with different perspectives who can, see blind spots. I think a lot of what the public perceives as deception in journalism, and this especially happens with religion coverage, it's not deception, it's true ignorance. It's the journalists really just not knowing what they don't know and not realizing what they've stumbled into and what they've said wrong. And that's, something the industry needs to work on, to have that diversity in the newsroom, to be able to provide those ideological checks and balances. And I also think for both the journalists and the public alike, it's very important to be clear about I think the distinction between opinion and reporting. So, as an opinion writer, being biased is my job. That's what people pay me for. That's pretty different from a reporter. But I also think that in this day and age, when we are all on social media, there's an advantage of simply acknowledging your bias publicly, even on the reporting side, so that maybe it does creep into your story sometime. Maybe it does lead to you getting something, getting a slant on something wrong, or missing some important point, or misinterpreting something. But if journalists are able to be open about their viewpoint, then that makes it easier for readers or viewers, or whatever the format is, for the audience to sort of take that into account and say, like, okay, John is a good reporter on the subject. I know what his bias is, so I can sort of be on the lookout for where he is most likely to get something wrong, and also where he's more likely to get something right because of how his perspective works to his advantage.
I appreciate the fact in your book you talk about the importance of transparency and the way it can really help readers to understand where a writer is coming from and how their perspective, their background, their religious beliefs, etc., might influence their opinion. But there's also a section where you point out two different headlines, which both share true facts, but give a very different spin. And you give a deeper understanding of how the way in which we write things can give very different perspectives. And I think that what that encouragement seems to offer, and what I have tried to encourage in others myself, is the fact that we all have to read prudentially with discernment whenever we come to any sort of article, even if it's in a publication that we generally trust and find to be very credible. There's always this process of reading with discernment, of looking for the adverbs and adjectives, or the way in which something is couched in a certain form of language that is pointing you in a certain direction. And the way in which we can practice that skill over time, I think, can be really helpful, perhaps. And then realizing we can read widely, we can read people we disagree with strongly, and read it with this air of discernment, and hopefully come out on the other side having learned and grown in really important ways. It doesn't have to be all deception or all ignorance that we bring to a news story. And I think there's just different virtues perhaps we could practice that then would set us free a little bit in the way we think about what we consume in our news.
Yeah, and I mentioned, in journalism, I think having more knowledgeable people, and people with specific subject matter knowledge, sort of, a lot of outlets used to have beat reporters or beat writers, people who focused on a single subject matter so they could develop expertise in that subject. And to some extent, my impression is that that's declined in recent years as budgets have been cut. People will say, well, we just don't have the budget to have a religion writer and a politics writer. One of you is going to have to cover both, which leads to a real loss. But I think as the audience, also as news consumers, it's important for us to sort of take that model as well, and limit the subjects to which we're paying attention, and try to know those well, because it's a lot easier to read with the prudence and the circumspection that you're describing if we actually have some basic knowledge in the topic that we're reading about. It's easier to figure out where the journalist's blind spots might have been if we have a sense of what are the recent developments in this, who are the major political figures who are relevant to this, what perspectives did they leave out? And we can't realistically have that kind of knowledge about everything. And so I think we have to really deliberately edit the topics that we're paying attention to. And if we do that, then that, as you said, frees us to broaden out the sources that we're reading on those subjects.
Mm-hmm. That's such a good point, and it leads me to your chapter on studiousness. You talk about studiousness as a disposition that might help us to read well and to govern our epistemic crisis, our knowledge crisis, and to come out the other side, hopefully better humans. So why does studiousness matter, and what are some of the different virtues or habits that undergird a position of studiousness in our lives?
So studiousness, in sort of the older model of seeing a virtue as in between two vices, like that happy medium. Studiousness is in between, on the one side, like a vicious curiosity, on the other, gullibility or obtuseness. And so, I mean, thinking about that spectrum, I think we see so much vicious curiosity. This in the sense of how we just consume information. We're really gluttonous for it. Things that we have no business knowing, that we don't need to know, things that we can, knowing about it will not help us, will not help the world. We're never going to do anything to improve anything on that subject. And then on the other side, that gullibility and obtuseness, where we believe things because we sort of want them to be true, or we just refuse to hear viewpoints that go against what we would like. And so studiousness in the middle it's about wanting to know the truth, but not by any means or at any cost. And so it's examining, why we want to know something, whether our path to knowing it is, an ethical path. Is it a good use of our time? How are we going to use that knowledge once we've acquired it? Is there an opportunity cost? Is there some other more worthwhile knowledge that we should be pursuing instead? And a lot of studiousness is also about our behavior, the way that we are treating others, the way that we, do we hold ourselves up as an expert or an authority without warrant? Are we disciplined? Are we making that move to sort of prudentially narrow our focus and realize our own limits, and only study the things that we can study well, only speak to the things that we actually know well, recognize, the places of our own ignorance, and when it is appropriate for us to defer to others who know more than we do. I think we think of studiousness as like something you want your high schooler to learn or something like that, not something that we would apply throughout our lives. But again, the way that we live now, the way that we are all constantly taking in so much information, I think is a virtue that we need to be cultivating, honestly, probably for the rest of our lives.
I love that too, because when Aristotle talks about virtue as a mean between excess and defect, he says that the virtue in question then reaches toward the good, which for him is eudaimonia. It's happiness. It's being well and doing well in the process of being well. But it suggests that there is some good that we should be seeking in the midst of our news consumption, that there's a telos we should be reaching to, and that it might not, in fact, just be the consumption of news or information for its own sake, which I think can very easily happen. But all the facts, all the news that we're learning and kind of deepening our knowledge of should be serving some purpose in our day-to-day life. So what is the telos that we should maybe consider in our news consumption? What are we reaching toward when we turn on the news, or when we pick up a newspaper, or when we're scrolling through social media?
I think to some degree it depends on the story that we're reading about, like the scale of it, if that makes sense, or the proximity of it. In a lot of cases, and this is harder to do given the decline of local news, for the most part, we're not going to pick up a newspaper or go online and read about something that's happening near us, something where we can actually do something to help. In some cases, I think that's the purpose, to find out what's happening in our communities and what we can do about it. And there's a C.S. Lewis passage from a letter he wrote that I quote in the book, which I think is so on point on this subject. And he basically makes the case that at times we use stories of faraway tragedies as a distraction and as an excuse not to attend to those local needs that we could actually do something about. We're so busy saying like, oh, that thing that happened over there is so terrible, that we don't do anything about the thing that's happening, 2 blocks away. When we're looking at bigger news stories and things that are farther away and that we can't directly affect, I think it depends. If it's one of those few topics that you've chosen to know well and to develop sort of a lay expertise in, I think there is some value in that in and of itself, like to be knowledgeable about a serious issue and to be able to study it and converse in it and speak to a weighty matter with a real degree of authority and hopefully along with that compassion for it. But again, this is very distinct from just the, take everything in as much as I can and sort of be generally well-informed. I think we have this idea that just being aware of things and knowing a lot about today's headlines is inherently good. And that sort of just broad and indiscriminate consumption, I would say, is not inherently good. It's not good for us. It's very shallow. It's easily forgotten. It's not something that we're really doing anything about. And it's often deleterious to our relationships. And, all the time and attention that we're spending on that is time and attention that we've taken from something else. And I think that's a question we should be asking ourselves much more often, which is, what would I be doing if I were not doing this and busy burnishing my sense of being a well-informed news consumer?
Yes, we have about 2 minutes before we'll open it up for Q&A. I wanted to ask one more question about loneliness, because you write that loneliness is a really crucial piece of this puzzle. It's definitely helping to foment this knowledge crisis and this obsession, perhaps, over the information that we can have through the internet and the amount of time we spend on social media. And you quote Hannah Arendt, who suggests that loneliness can lead us to lose touch with reality. She says we need the trusting and trustworthy company of our equals in order to gain knowledge and to grasp truth. It is in loneliness that, quote, man loses trust in himself as the partner of his thoughts and that elementary confidence in the world which is necessary to make experiences at all. Your words reminded me of Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone and also Tim Carney's more recent book, Alienated America, because both suggest that there's this vital associational piece to our larger communal and political puzzle, the way we both read and interpret information that we receive about the world around us. So building trust through institutions seems to help us have confidence and hope, not just on a local or personal level, but in national political matters as well. So my question for you is, how is this also an associational and a communal issue? And how do we love our neighbor, especially those we might disagree with at this particular moment?
Yeah, I think the loneliness piece, we really get into something of a vicious cycle, right? So as relationships and institutions break down, we feel lonely. And so we go online or turn on the news or whatever and fill our time with that and feel like our human interaction is happening with the talking head on the television or with the people with whom we're yelling about something on Twitter. And then that in turn makes us more extreme in our views, often more antagonistic in the way that we hold them and the way that we communicate them, which makes it harder to maintain relationships, makes it harder to be in institutions with people who disagree. And so we become more lonely. And so we go on Twitter and so on and so forth. How we love our neighbors and across those divides, I don't think there's an easy, quick answer to it. And this was something that I wrote in the last chapter that I think a lot of people who may be inclined to buy a book like this sort of already think, I know that there's this epistemic crisis. I know that things are bad with the way that we're engaging online and then dealing with each other as a result. And my parents or my friends or whomever are really, really bad about it. And hopefully this book can tell me how to fix them and how I can, still have a enjoyable relationship with them, even though they're so wrong. And it would have been great if I had come to the end of the book and been like, all right, here's the 3 steps, and you do these steps, and then it's fixed, and your relationship is easy again, and it's convenient to love them again because now you agree on stuff, and they have recognized that you were right all along. Unfortunately, I don't think it works that way. I don't think that we can expect a quick resolution and where it's going to somehow suddenly become easy to love people. I think that's always true, but especially here. And so it's a long game, and it's not easy, and it can't be purely strategic. Like I don't think you're going to have a very good relationship if your whole relationship is you trying to convince the other person of the way that you're right and they're bad at doing the internet. And so, I go into this in a lot more detail in the book, but the short version of it is that we have to be spending time with people in ways that are not just arguing with them, or honestly barely, if ever, arguing with them about this stuff at all. And I keep going back to the matter of attention and time use, because every minute that you're spending with someone, and you're having a meal together, or you're taking a walk, or you're talking about your vacation plans, or what have you, that's a minute that they're not spending plunging deeper into knowledge crisis. It's a minute they're not spending arguing on the internet or watching cable news. And so, that's not like a sure fix. That doesn't make it easier to love them. But I think in many cases, that's what we're called to do, and also realistically, the only thing we can do.
Yeah. I do appreciate you have, I think at the beginning and end of the book, you really address this piece of what does it mean to live alongside and to love people who we are deeply in disagreement with on some of these issues surrounding politics, culture, and news consumption, etc. And the suggestion that arguing doesn't fix anything does seem, at least from my own observation and personal life, to be true. And what it means to love each other and to live alongside one another in the midst of deep disagreement is something I think that both requires a lot of prudence and particular knowledge of the people that you are living with, and a lot of grace and mercy for the struggles that will inevitably, I think, come alongside that. But you have some really beautiful stories about how those sort of deep relationships and determinations to love also have impacted the people in question's news consumption and some of the things that were tending perhaps in a bad direction in their lives. And so it is always, I think, encouraging to see those hopeful stories and to realize this isn't just a dream. It's actually worked for a lot of people who are in these sorts of relationships.
Yeah, I hope so. And yeah, again, it would be easy if there were some quick fix, but that's not how people work. And I think it's also important to remember that all that time we're spending, just living with and having a normal non-internet time with folks with whom we disagree, that's also, it's also good for us. It's also time we're not spending on the internet. And so, however it works out, whether it ends up, producing the effect you're hoping for in the other person, it's good for you as well, and for your own cultivation of better habits.
Absolutely. We have some excellent questions, so I'm going to jump right into those with our time that we have left. Vicky says, a friend and I were talking about the wrecking of Nuance. A mutual friend of ours has gone back to teaching after 7 years, and her students are oblivious to Nuance in the way her previous ones were not. I gain knowledge, she says, from novels and seeing the nuance of, say, one person's story in all these details, but culture wars seem to wreck nuance. Can you talk about how to help with that on any scale?
That's a good question. I don't know that there are large-scale fixes for this and for a lot of things. I think we want there to be large-scale fixes, and a lot of times you'll hear people saying, like, well, if we just had better content moderation policies on social media, if we put warnings on bad tweets and said, like, here's some additional context, that's going to fix it. In practice, I don't think that works super well, because for the most part, people are not seeing those bad tweets or hearing some unnuanced account and deciding on the basis of just pure reason. And, this case is just so logical and compelling that this is what I believe. We're a lot more emotional. It's a lot more about who is the speaker. Are they, making their case in a way that is sympathetic to me? Does it feel like they're attacking me? Do I think they would like me? All these kinds of things. Does my stomach hurt because my last meal was bad? All these kinds of things play into how we decide things. And so for trying to seek a greater appreciation of nuance, I think at least in the classroom setting, you have you have a captive audience to be able to talk about these things in a really deliberate way that we don't often have online. You know, in other spaces, you can toss out all the nuance you want, but if people don't want to listen, you can't make them listen. At least in a classroom setting, you have some institutional context in which to say, no, this is what we're doing. We are going to talk about this, and we are going to look at this more nuanced perspective. Depending on how old these students are, I guess that would sort of affect some of what I would say beyond that. It's interesting that to describe such a quick change over just a few years. And so I'm curious to know more about that story. But I think in many cases, if the best thing we can do in something like that is to present and model what we want people to see and notice. And if you have a good teacher-student relationship, if students really admire the teacher and appreciate their teaching, then there is oftentimes that desire to imitate and to take seriously what the teacher says. And so I'm again going back to the same relational theme, but I think in many cases that is really what it comes down to sort of earn someone's trust enough that they will give you a hearing and sort of move past their initial knee-jerk reaction against whatever it is you're suggesting.
Mm. I really appreciate that. I think too, there seemed to be a set of writers, you included, who really model nuance in the way that they present their own opinions, and they can be a really good guide, I think, to grappling with very thorny or controversial issues with that sort of nuance that prevents us from perhaps having our own knee-jerk reactions. As we read their work, I think we begin to grow ourselves in some of the virtues of nuance that we're trying to promote. Timothy says, what would you say to those who are worn out by the epistemic crisis and have become apathetic about all news media and other sources of information?
I'd say log off. You don't have to read the news every day. You don't have to be well informed. If you're concerned about being, well informed enough to vote responsibly, you can probably dive in for a couple weeks before election day. But we have, if you live in the United States, we have on purpose a system of representational government where you are supposed to be able to delegate your political responsibility, and that includes the space it takes up in your brain and the energy it takes up. You're supposed to be able to delegate it to someone. Now, do they do a great job? Not necessarily, but you being concerned about it and worked up about it from reading about it every day will not affect the job they do in the least. So if you are burnt out, stop consuming it, read a book, watch TV, go on a walk, do literally anything else that seems better to you, because it probably is better. And you don't have to be plugged in all day to sort of have done your duty as an American or a Christian or whatever the case may be. There's this really great quote from, I think it's John Adams, maybe it's John Quincy Adams, one of those guys. He was writing in a letter, and it's something to the effect of, like, I study politics so that my sons can study, math and science and architecture, and my grandsons can study art and music, and poetry. And I think that idea that we should sort of get the baseline of politics settled so that we can move on to better things, I think we've forgotten that. And we've made politics like our national hobby and something that everyone is supposed to be interested in and studying all the time. And that's not true. You don't need to do it all day, every day. So if you want to take a break, definitely take a break.
As someone who has taken a little bit of a break for that very reason, I would wholeheartedly agree. I think the other thing that was really helpful for a while was to not really pay much attention to the day-to-day of national politics, and to instead focus very specifically on local news. And what I found it was about a year where I was primarily just reading local newspapers, what I found was that the news was not less horrific at times. Local news can be very, very tragic and very, very hard to read. But there was much more of a tangible sense of the things that could be done to help, whether it was supporting a local charity or coming alongside a local association, or even just praying over something that had happened in the local community. And then there were also a lot more funny or lighthearted or positive stories to counterbalance that. And it was a lot less about fighting back and forth, although that's still always a part of any policy discussion that might be had local or national. But there were much more opportunities to come alongside and to celebrate and to mourn with a group of people. And so it felt very tangible in a way that I think was encouraging. Samuel asks, both of you are Substack writers. Do you see technology like Substack playing a role in a reforming journalism and rebuilding a sense of trust between audience and writer?
I don't know. I go back and forth on that. I think, so, journalism pre-internet was a cash cow. It was before Craigslist and then Facebook Marketplace came along. Everybody sold stuff and listed jobs through classifieds. The local newspaper, other than like a billboard, the local newspaper was where you advertised if you wanted to advertise. And so that offered a real freedom. You didn't have to sensationalize your local news story to pay the bills, because you weren't competing for like clicks and views in the same way you are now, and because there was just a steady stream of money coming in. And so a lot of the chaos in the media industry in the past 2 decades or so, and honestly, it's really only in the past 15 years that we've gotten into the current model of like Google ads and Facebook ads and the vast multiplication of other ways to advertise things, which has gutted the old revenue model. It's still super fresh, all of that happening. And so, the subscription model is coming back. And Substack, of course, has been emblematic of that. On the favorable side for Substack, for writers who do have sort of their own following, it can allow that very personal connection with readers. It can allow a lot of freedom. It can allow people to support good journalism when they see it. And I think that's great. What it doesn't do, though, when you have writers striking out on their own like that, and especially those big names, sort of like the best known Substackers, the way it's sort of supposed to work, the way it's worked for a long time, is that your big names like that, the people who write the must-read articles, if they're in an outlet context, their work subsidizes the sort of more boring but very necessary stuff. It subsidizes the people who go to like the town hall meetings. It subsidizes the very long, slow, unprofitable investigative reporting. It subsidizes, just sort of like all the basic stuff, the fact collection that is not glamorous, that is not quote unquote must read. And if all of those subsidizers go out on their own, who is paying for that baseline stuff? Because readers don't want to pay for it. They want to jump a paywall. They want to, there's this idea that all the content on the internet must be free to us. And so, yeah, I think that's my biggest concern about Substack, that if all the money draw voices go away, even if they manage to make a subscription model work for them, what becomes of like the sort of workaday journalism on which honestly their work depends, right? Because as opinion writers, we need that underlying basis of reporting to have something on which to comment. Who is going to pay for that? And that's why I don't know that it's really like the answer. I think maybe it's a piece of the answer, but it doesn't really seem like a standalone solution to me. My own Substack is free right now and has been 80% book promotion. And so I don't really know, once this, like the book launch is all done and I have like maybe another month or two's worth of plans for book related stuff on there, I don't know if I'll keep going or not. Yeah, because I think I for myself, I'm more interested in writing in an outlet context where there's other voices also.
And I think that, as you point out, there's so much importance to the world of reporting, putting together stories that offer original content built off of interviews, off of research, off of all of that. And that's a piece of my own writing life that I haven't been able to indulge in as much as a mother. And frankly, right now, any revenue that I bring in through Substack would never cover that sort of the expenses that you accrue doing that sort of work. I'd love to go back to it at some point. If I were able to, I would have to work for an outlet in order to get the support I need to do it. And so I do think that at this point, that is, I would say, a disadvantage of the model. The other thing I would say, and I would quote your book in saying it, is that we need a lot of voices around us in order to form good opinions and to grow and to mature as writers, as individuals, and as thinkers. And this is something I wrote down because I really appreciated it. You said, we need one another to perceive angles on reality we would miss on our own. We need people with different perspectives, not only to answer questions we can't, but also to ask questions we've never conceived. And I think one huge advantage that traditional publications still have is that as institutions, they build that sort of dialogue. You are working with editors who are critiquing and growing your work in really important ways. Now, one huge advantage for me, at least, is I have the best readers who do that sort of work and who email me and who hold me accountable in ways that make them good editors in a sense. But I still think it's really valuable to have those people in your life, whether you're working for an institution or not, who are bringing that sort of communal thought alongside the work that you're doing. All right, so Logan asks, what are some basic tips for teaching children as they grow into adolescents and teenagers how to be prudent consumers of news and information?
So I think the first thing I would say on that point is there's this idea that we need to teach children facility with devices and with the internet. And many schools will boast about like, oh, every child gets an iPad. And I would say that in terms of that basic facility and cultural knowledge, you don't need to teach anything. Like don't devote an hour of formal instruction to using an iPad because your kid will know automatically as if they were born knowing. The thing that actually needs to be taught is much more, discerning different kinds of content. It's tricky because it's not like you can sort of sit someone down and say, here are the things to look for, right? It's like it really is like a whole culture. If you tried to, and this is why I find it so difficult often to communicate with older generations who are not so familiar with the internet, where they'll be looking at I've had conversations where we're looking at the same web page and I'll say like, yeah, you see this looks really sketchy. And they'll say, what looks sketchy about it? And it's just sort of the whole thing. And if you can't see it, I can't tell you. And it's like if someone said, well, what is American culture like? Where to even begin? It's a whole thing. You just have to experience it. And I think to some extent, that's also true of the internet and of children, learning to read and parse the news and figure out what's trustworthy. And so I would say probably my three biggest things would be place limits around that initial exposure. There's going to be a whole lifetime of your kid having unfettered access to the internet. And when they're young, that lifetime doesn't have to start quite yet. Two, I would say is like, if you found high quality sources that you generally think are trustworthy, start them there. Like one of the best ways to get a taste for, it's like how we get a taste for good books is hopefully in school, you're getting a list of good books to read and sort of get a feel, like the way that you can feel the difference between cotton and polyester, get a feel for what a good book is like, get a feel for what a good news outlet is like, because it's much less about individually easily communicable attributes as having sort of that automatic taste for it. And then the third thing I think is just like, if you're concerned especially that your kid is maybe not figuring it out, talk about it deliberately, like pull up perhaps 2 reports on the same story, one of which is done well and one of which is done poorly, and say, can we figure out why one of these is worse than the other, and what are the differences? I think having those sorts of specific comparisons may be a more practical and intelligible way to to communicate like, what am I looking for, as opposed to just talking about it in the abstract.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Carrie McKean writes, you've given me a deeper understanding of why painting rooms of my house has lately been a far more healthy use of my time rather than engaging even respectfully with strangers on the internet. Also in making me reconsider the value of being generally well-informed. Thank you. The last few days I've been struck by stories like this one. The American Teachers Union president has gone to Ukraine to consider how the American Teachers Union can be engaged. I found myself annoyed, feeling like this is an example of how everyone is expected to be an expert about everything, that staying in one's lane is no longer valuable in spite of the problems facing American education right now in this case. Do you think this is tied to the general knowledge crisis we're all facing? Pressure for public figures to remain relevant by weighing in on everything, or is it something else?
Hi, Carrie. Carrie is a friend in Texas. Yeah, I would say I think it is related. I saw that story and I have not had time to read about it, but I did have just like a passing thought of why is she there? Because, you know, what does the war in Ukraine have to do with getting good wages for teachers? These are totally unconnected things. Yeah, so I think experts, especially in more academic and public fields, are increasingly expected to have a public presence. And that can go awry in a number of ways, two of which are most common are, one, you may be a legitimate expert in one field and really bad at communication. And so we have people who, you know, are actually knowledgeable about something, but they do not have a second expertise in talking to the public and speaking in ways that a lot of people can understand without confusion. And so this expectation that everyone who is an expert also be a public figure is not a great thing. But maybe the risk is even worse when you have someone who actually is a pretty good communicator, who does perform well when they're, you know, invited on cable or they're up on Twitter or whatever. Because then I think what happened in this case is what happens. There's not always something to comment on within their own lane. And so people will invite them or they will suggest themselves to comment on something else where they might have an opinion. But it's not actually something they have much expert knowledge on. The true sort of like general interest expert, what we used to call a public intellectual, is pretty rare. Most people are not that. Most people, yeah, should sort of stick within their own field of expertise, at least when it comes to public comment. But experts are not, that pressure to broaden out and to have an opinion on everything. I think we all feel it, and we all sort of make ourselves into miniature pundits. But when you already have a big platform because of your expertise in one area, then when you give into that temptation and broaden out, you're going to potentially sort of wreak more havoc than the average person with their 200 Facebook followers.
And I think it's interesting that this is a lot of pressure that I think columnists can feel as well. Whatever the big news story is that's consuming all of the air in the online conversation becomes a thing that you really feel pressured to write about. But of course, I think both the challenge and the joy of trying to write publicly is to figure out how to keep writing about the same things well, without boring everyone, hopefully, and there's hopefully a growing understanding of how important that is for readers as well as for us.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of editors, to be able to say, you know, if an editor comes to you and says, do you want to write something about X? Especially if it's, you know, a prominent outlet, you very much want to say yes, even though sometimes your answer should be no, I don't really have an opinion on that, or no, that's outside my area of expertise. And, you know, ideally, hopefully you have an editorial relationship where they'll say, you know, that's okay. And that doesn't mean you'll never publish with them again. But that's the fear, right? That if I don't keep talking constantly, then I will lose the opportunity to talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question from Vicky that I think is really interesting. How can I be patient with friends who are very attached to that identity of I am a well-informed news consumer? I probably have some guilt over reading very, very little news, but also I'm trying to live in a way where I'm not measured by that.
I would say on the one hand, there are probably some steps you can take to sort of reduce your own exposure to your friends' well-informedness. For example, I have unsubscribed to almost all of my friends' stories on Instagram, those little posts that disappear after 24 hours, because most people don't want to put like an ugly political headline or something on in their main pictures. Like they put pictures of their families and their meals and nice things on there, but the stories are just politics, politics, politics. And so, because I find it absurd to go from like your kitten to your latest cause and back and forth, I just, don't view those. And so I think to the extent that you can sort of limit your encounter of that stuff from your friends, that can help. But if it's coming up in sort of inescapable ways, so for me, I just don't really talk about politics in real life. Like I have an easier excuse. I can say I don't want to talk shop because it is shop for me. But change the subject just constantly. I don't know. You might have to sort of explicitly mention it and say, like, I know this is a big hobby for you, but I'm just not well informed on that subject, and I don't feel like I can really even keep up in the conversation with you. So can we talk about X? Maybe that sort of like directly speaking about it will be necessary, but I think in a lot of cases you can just sort of redirect and gradually, if your friend isn't getting sort of the engagement on that subject that they desire, they might stop coming back to it.
Final question from Danielle. We can all decide not to consume all of the news and quote fake news, but ultimately, how is this altering the future of what we would like to be able to consume? How are we cultivating any change by removing ourselves?
Well, I would say if you do want to, well, first, let me back up. One, I would say is, I think we have a little bit, in some cases, of an overinflated sense of our ability to cultivate change. A lot of times you just can't. But if you want to, and you want to play some small part in that, put your clicks and your money with worthwhile things. Every time you click on an article, that tells a media outlet, this is what people want to see. And often it tells them in very great detail. You can go all the way down. The analytics that are available to media outlets are incredibly detailed now. You can test out different headlines, see which turn of phrase made people angrier, which one made them share this more, which one brought in, more eyeballs and therefore more advertising revenues, small as they are. Every time we jump a paywall at some like good outlet, we're telling that outlet, I don't actually value what you do. Even though, ironically, you do value it, right? You wouldn't have jumped the paywall to read it unless you placed value in it. But when you won't pay for it, that's sending a signal of this is not a profitable enterprise. This is not something that will let us pay our bills. And so I think if you want to make a change in this direction, find some good media outlets that are doing honest reporting, that are doing, well-reasoned, nuanced opinion writing, and give them your money, and then read them and not the other stuff. Journalism is a business. It's subject to the same market signals as everything else. And I've talked a lot about like where the money comes from and how that affects how the media works, because it is really crucial. I mean, people have to eat. And if the signals over and over again are the way you can pay your bills is by writing clickbait garbage, and that is what the signals are, then there's going to be more clickbait garbage. So if you want to have good journalism out there, pay for good journalism.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Oh my goodness, so many thoughtful questions. Thank you, everyone. I think I only got through half of mine, but I hope that this will be an ongoing conversation and that all of you will pick up Bonnie's book. The title, once again, is Untrustworthy: The Knowledge Crisis Breaking Our Brains, Polluting Our Politics, and Corrupting Christian Community. So thank you, everyone, so much for coming today. And thank you, Bonnie, for sharing your time with us and for answering these questions with such wisdom.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And anyone who had, further questions or didn't get enough of an answer, definitely, I am unfortunately on social media. Feel free to come find me and ask again.
Yes, if you could share your handles, that would be great. That way people can go find you if they're not following you already.
Yeah, the easiest is probably Twitter, and it's just Bonnie Kristian there. And then I think Instagram is bonnie.kristian and Facebook is Bonnie Kristian Writes.
Perfect. And if you want to follow Granola, it's granola.substack.com. You can also find me on Twitter at Gracy Olmstead. That's Gracy with a Y. I don't always post a lot these days because I have 3 kids who keep me pretty busy, but I try to post the important stuff. So thank you all again, and I hope you have a lovely Tuesday.